പോവുകയാണ്. Hello all. Welcome to the international webinar on photojournalism, a solutions-based approach for visual storytelling organized by the Department of Media Studies and Quality Assurance Cell of Nagar College, Maranellur, Trivandrum, Kerala, India. I am Manju Rose Matthews, Head of the Department of Media Studies. On behalf of the Principal, Dr. Jolie Jacob, Director and Manager, Reverend Dr. Tito Verghese CMI, and the organizing team, Emil Abraham, our Program Coordinator, Tara CB, Reverend Father Tinto Pulinchivelil CMI, and Nino PK, we welcome you all to this webinar. Good morning to Dr. Tara Pixley, who has joined us early morning from Los Angeles, United States. Good afternoon, Daniel Rai, who has joined us from Denmark, and Renee Carnegie from Loughborough University, United Kingdom. And good evening, Ms. Archana Sarang, who is joining us from Odisha, India. This is our fourth webinar in the series on providing insights into constructive journalism, and we are thankful for your great support and encouragement for the cause of bringing a much required change in journalism. This is our humble endeavor for equipping media students, media educators, and media professionals with the knowledge and skill set for solutions-based journalism. We had a great response from all over the world for this webinar. We have participants joining in from Argentina, United States, Canada, Belgium, United Kingdom, South Africa, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Malaysia. Over 1,100 participants have joined us from all over India. Students, researchers, and media educators from journalism schools, universities, colleges, and media organizations. We also have a good number of freelance photojournalists and photography enthusiasts for this webinar. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. Photojournalism is undergoing a rapid transformation in the digital age. New platforms, new technologies, and innovative ways of visual storytelling have opened up great opportunities for photojournalists. Photojournalists can engage both public and decision makers with compelling stories that seek change. Every photo need not represent sadness, suffering, and violence to make an impact. The new solutions-based approach in photojournalism can be used for public action and social change with visual stories that highlight issues of human rights, poverty, gender, education, and climate change. Research shows that solution-based visual reporting is more engaging. This webinar brings together award-winning international photojournalists and thought leaders to provide insight about new approaches to visual storytelling and the evolving career paths in photojournalism. We are starting with our first session. Participants can key in the questions which they have for the speakers. Our moderator shall ask the questions in the question and answer session. The link for posting your questions is in the comment box. Participants also have the option to vote up the best questions for asking the speakers. Our first speaker is Daniel Rai. Daniel Rai is a Danish freelance photojournalist. In 2013, he was kidnapped by the ISIS while reporting on the refugee crisis in northern Syria and was held hostage for 398 days. Once he was released in the summer of 2014, Daniel returned to his profession as a photographer straight away after his release from captivity. Daniel went from being a photographer telling other people's stories to being the story himself. That journey has changed his way of looking at journalism, in particular, international reporting. This change can be seen in his latest work, a photography book entitled While We Wait, Means We Wander, about the coming climate refugee crisis. Daniel shall take us through his journey as photojournalist and his thoughts on how he approaches photojournalism. The topic of his presentation is Visual Storytelling for the New World. Welcome, Daniel, once again.
Thank you so much. I hope that everybody can hear me. So, yeah, as introduced, I am a Danish photographer, and I was held hostage for 13 months back from 2013 to 2014. I tried to be a victim. I really relied on other people to help me get back home alive. And in that way, I kind of felt the need of being humble and put my life in other people's hands. So when I came back to Denmark, I more than ever had the need to continue doing photojournalism because I wanted to, the way people have helped me getting out of Syria, I also wanted to give a voice to the smaller people and their who doesn't have a voice internationally. So basically, I started researching for this book. You can see here, it's called While We Wait in English, Mens vi venter in Danish. So basically, this is a story about about a guy. His name is Mr. Condisa, and you can see he's standing right here. He is a local farmer in the land Malawi, and basically he's representing 750 million people in the southern part of Africa who are relying on being able to grow crops as farmers. So basically, I tried to see how is climate change affecting Denmark. Denmark is a small country in the northern part of Europe. We are only 6 million people. And most of the time, people don't really care about climate change. I guess one of the reasons is that it's not very visible in our part of the world. So I started to researching, trying to figure out how can I give the Danish people an idea that climate change can affect our life. So doing my research, I came across the word climate refugees. So basically, there was a study telling that in 2050, there will be around 250 million climate refugees globally. That's a huge number, especially when we look at the refugee crisis that have been going on, especially in 2015 from Syria and from other conflict-torn countries who have tried to take this route across Europe. Some of them have reached Denmark, walking on our highways. It was a big story, and everybody was talking about refugees, that refugees are coming and destroying our small community. So I knew that basically refugees was a hot topic in Denmark. But in my view, if we look at Syria, it's 18 million people. it's a relative small number when you look at these 750 million people who basically can be a part of this problem, not being able to grow their crops and have to start a journey towards a better life. That's in general, that's a big story. And also when you do a story in Africa, in a country like Malawi, a lot of people, especially Denmark, they look at a place like Africa as a completely third world country that are always facing bad situations like droughts and floodings and famines, etc., etc. But somehow I traveled to Malawi back in 2016, and I was very lucky that I met this person, Mr. Kondisa. He quickly became the head character of my book, because when you're talking about basically 700 million people, 750 million people who are having issues farming the same way as they used to because of droughts and floodings, we kind of have to cook that down to one person that we somehow can identify with. And for me, Mr. Kondisa was a perfect case, because he is able of speaking English, so I could live in his house. I actually slept in that room for the 3 months that I stayed with him, and always I could ask him questions if I had anything. Otherwise, I just lived my life, his life with him. I ate the same food as him. I went with him to the gardens and helped him farming and hung out with the kids and so on and so on. So I became a part of his life, trying to understand how his life have kind of changed during the last, especially 25 years. And he's talking about the fact that that the drought period, that the dry season has become increasingly longer and longer, and the rainy season has become shorter and shorter, which has often turns into floodings. It's not very easy for him to grow his crops, and often he put seeds into the ground and they never come up. So he has to somehow dig a well and try to water his plants, and he has a very simple life in many ways, and a very beautiful life. I managed to stay with him for these 3 months, and I learned a lot about how a life can be when you are living below the poverty line. And so therefore I decided to photograph all the pictures in colors, because I don't see the world in black and white anymore. It's very nuanced, and basically there is a lot of hope in my way of looking at a story like Mr. Kondisa's. He is a hard-working farmer, and basically when he was on top of his life, it was in 2014, he had the maximum wealth, and when he talk about wealth and his uh, finances, he talks about it in his cows, because that's basically where he put all the money he earns. He invests them in cows so he can sell them if he needs money, and if he don't need money, hopefully they can make cow babies, and his small and his farm can grow by having more cows. But the drought came, and he had to sell some of his cows to buy a new field in the lower part of the area where there is more moist in the ground. And in last time I visited him in 2019, he only had 7 cows left, because he needed to sell something to buy new land. He also needed to sell something to continue putting his children to school. And also the drought kind of did that he didn't have a profit of whatever he was doing. So that's his main issue. And I was there through 6 trips in total, and the first 5 of them was a drought. There was it was a very it was dry periods. It was very hot, and he really struggled making his crops grow. And they were very much relying on international aid to not die of starvation. And what I found very interesting talking to Mr. Condisa was the fact that he didn't see his life as being worse than it was 25 years ago. He actually told me one day in a taxi, or not a taxi, but a local minibus that was taking us to the market. I asked him, "Don't you think that the life is unfair? Here I come with my camera and everything. I stay at your house, but then I leave again in a big airplane that is causing a lot of carbon dioxide into the air, causing more global warming, and so on and so on." And he looked at me and he said, "No, Daniel, I don't think that my life is bad. I don't think that things are unbalanced." Basically, when you look back, he told me, and he pointed into the school that we were passing. He said, 25 years ago, there was only boys who was going to school, but today 60% of the students at our schools here in Kakoma in Malawi, 60% are girls now. And that's a great change that have been happening throughout the last 25 years. And then we continued driving, and he pointed towards the hospital, and he said, "Daniel, 25 years ago, people died from very, very simple sicknesses." He mentioned HIV, that today we don't die as easily because we can go to the hospitals, we can stand in line every Wednesday and get medication to hold down the HIV, and people don't die of it anymore. And then we continue driving, and he pointed towards what you can see on the picture here, a small barn where the World Food Program delivers the corns to hand out the aid for the local people. And he said 25 years ago, people died of starvation when there was a drought like we're seeing right now. But today, the international system has changed, and they are so much more aware of our situation. So we don't die anymore when there is a drought. We don't fear of dying, and that's a huge improvement in our lives. So in that way, he kind of told me, and I went to Malawi to kind of document how bad his situation was, and then he told me that it has never been better. So I saw that as a huge conflict in my way of doing photojournalism, because I tried to show the rest of the world how bad things were, and he couldn't identify with that. That was not how he saw his world, but he still had a big problem, and that was that he couldn't invest money. He lost his cows. He lost his way of investing whenever the years passed. So he lost more and more cows, and it wasn't sustainable for his way of living. And that way, I kind of got a much better idea of the way that he was looking at the world. And in that way, I kind of started to look at the world from Mr. Condisa's perspective. And I decided to do a book that was not mostly about bad pictures of his world collapsing around him, but I tried to photograph the everyday life. And that picture you can see right here on the screen, that's his 2 grandsons, Kelvin and Jole. Uh, and this picture kind of completely changed my way to
Hello,
photograph.
Daniel. Sorry to
Sorry,
interrupt. We are not able to see your screen.
you cannot see my screen?
Yeah. Could you share it again?
Yes. Let's see how we do that. sorry.
Yeah, you can use the share screen button.
Yeah, share.
Yeah, we can see that.
Have you not seen any pictures yet?
No, no.
Ah, that's not good. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
we can see that.
Let's just, so basically what you can see here, that's Mr. Condisa. So that was the first picture I showed you. And there he's standing in his room. And this was the room where I was sleeping. This is Mr. Condisa watering his plants in the fields. And this is Mr. Condisa digging a well so he can water his plants because of drought. He cannot rely on rain anymore. He needs to water things himself. And this is the barn where you can see the aid from World Food Program being delivered. And this is the picture that I was talking about. So basically, this is his two grandsons, Jolie and Kelvin. And this picture, especially, as I told you, changed my way of photographing, because I showed a lot of pictures to my friend at back home. He's not a photo editor. He's not an expert in photography, not at all. He's just a teacher. And I asked him to look all my pictures through, and he stopped when he saw this picture, and he said, "Hey, that's strange. They are living in such a bad condition, and then they are standing there in a nice suit, looking great. And what's up with all this?" And I realized that he was more moved by a picture of two guys standing in a suit rather than pictures of children laying at a hospital, not knowing if they're going to die from tuberculosis, malnutrition, HIV, tuberculosis, or what do you call it, of hunger. So basically, I decided to photograph the whole story, very much the everyday life, and I tried to, as much as possible, creating a link that people in Denmark could identify with, and kind of see themselves through the mirror and get feelings for this family, for Mr. Condisa and his sons, and try to take out the simple parts in their lives, not showing how bad everything was. In that way, it was much easier for me to get the attentions of the viewers of my pictures, and from there on, I could start talking about his life, how he managed to try to adapt to the weather that was changing, and that really caught the attention of people that I showed my pictures to. And I do a lot of lectures here in Denmark. And when I do lectures and I stand in front of an audience of 400 people, I can feel their way of being moved by a picture or moved by whatever I'm telling them for a story. And I could feel that they was much more interested in that simple everyday life that they could identify with. So the last trip I had in March 2019, there was a huge flooding. Basically, it came while I was on the airplane on the way to Malawi from Denmark, and there was no doubt that the ground was completely destroyed by these mass water floodings. Highways was damaged, and their crops was dying. And in a way, because I decided to go back again and again and again, I managed to get both the drought period and the flooding period. Meanwhile, I was very close to one single family and not trying to photograph 100 of different people. So at the end, I'm doing what I call constructive journalism. So it's not only enough for me to go down there and photograph the fact that there is an issue, there is a problem, but I also need to show them there is some kind of hope. So the last question I asked Mr. Condisa before I went back to Denmark from my last trip was, what is your biggest wish right now? And he told me that his biggest wish was a motorized water pump. If he got one of those, he could share it with 10 of his neighbor, and they could water their fields with a big pump instead of having to use their water cans. And that way they could adapt to these changing weather patterns. And whenever I do lectures and I talk about this, I always stop my lecture telling about Mr. Condisa's wish for a motorized water pump. And when you say a motorized water pump, you get a very clear image in your head of an engine standing up, putting water through it, and you can see Mr. Condisa watering his plants. The reason why he can't buy it himself is that if he get a loan in the bank, the interest fees would be like 40%, which is a lot. He cannot pay it back. It will be big, a way too big risk for him to take. But basically, a motorized water pump, if we take it up on a bigger perspective, that's what we call climate change adaptation. So a way of adapting into the weather changing. So basically, this story ended up being a story to Danish people about a normal farmer who has a wish for a water pump. And if we in Denmark want to avoid not only 250 million climate refugees coming to Denmark for a better life, that is a very conservative number. Somebody talks about billions of people who will move across countries in a few decades. If we want to stop that from happening, if we want to stop people from invading our life, we have to invest in their give them opportunity to adapt into the changing weather, to sustain their own life. And in bottom line, I asked Mr. Condisa, do you want to flee? Do you want to leave your house and go somewhere else? And he said, never. I will never go. But that's not the same story if we talk to his children, because none of his children wants to go in his father's footsteps. They want to go anywhere else. His two sons wants to go abroad studying. His two eldest daughters, their husbands are living in Johannesburg in South Africa, working, sending money back to Kakoma. His second eldest daughter is trying to put up a big, what do you call it, kiosk in Blantyre, the second biggest city in Malawi. But when I visit that shop, she was standing there, and right next to her there was 10 others who were selling exactly the same thing. In the same hope of not having to go in their father's footsteps, farming a ground that is not able to provide them with enough to survive. So that's basically my story. That's how I wanted to make a 3 years of work and kind of push it down to one single idea, and that is the importance of talking about climate refugees and also talking about how we can somehow help them to stay where they want to be in their own homes, adapting to the changing climate, so we don't face one of the biggest threats to the international world, and one of the biggest threats is climate change and changing weather patterns. Yeah. Any
Okay.
questions?
Thank you, Daniel. There are a lot of questions for you. Now, our moderator, Tara, will do the question answer session.
Good evening, Daniel.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
Daniel, moderator is picking up the questions. She'll be asking you.
Perfect. I'm ready.
Shall I ask the first question, sir? I'm myself Sarah Ravishankar. I'll be moderating the session.
Perfect.
Have you done story of victim's life after climate crisis on flood?
So basically, after I published this book, I haven't been able to go back to Malawi again. Basically because of the whole COVID-19 situation. But my aim is basically to go back to Malawi and not focus so much on the impact of the floodings towards the local people. I have done my stories of Mr. Kondisa and how the flooding affected him. And what is kind of interesting is that he's not seeing the flooding as a big problem because, yeah, it destroys 4 months of field work for him. But basically, it gives moist to the ground. It's better to have a flooding than no water at all. So he doesn't see it as a big problem. It's better than no water, basically. But what I want to do when I continue to visit Mr. Kondisa is to help him to get a motorized water pump. So when I did this book, we also decided to try to make 30 extra copies of the book, which we called a collector's item. And it was a little bit more pricier than the other book, and that gave us around $1,000. And for that, I will go down to Mr. Kondisa and I will give him these monies, and he will be able to go and buy the water pump that he wants. And then I will do my next story on how they are managing this motorized water pump. Basically, to do a story about how they deal with the help that they probably can get. But I don't see myself as an activist. I don't want to go down there and try to give them something that can make their life better. That's not my job. I'm a photojournalist, but I want to make it very clear that I gave him the opportunity to buy a motorized water pump, and then I will make a story about how are they able to actually use this water pump. Will that go 1 year and it's completely destroyed and it was $1,000 just out the window, or will they manage to go together as a group, 10 farmers, to share this water pump, put some money to the side to buy a new water pump, invite 10 more farmers into this, and kind of make a sustainable way of watering their fields and make a sustainable way of living in Kakoma and Malawi. And in that way, I hope that I can somehow put in a way of saying this is an opportunity to deal with this huge crisis that we are looking forward to see. But I know that it's a kind of a strange way of going as a journalist, because usually you just stand completely neutral and see what's going on. But here I have been for 3 months, over 3 years, and looking at him, seeing what is he doing. And now I would like to test him. I would like to see, is this a completely shitty idea? Should we do something completely else, or is it actually a very good way of dealing with this ongoing crisis?
Thank you, sir. Let us move on to the next question. Your question is here. How should we approach a photo essay to show sensitive topics like rape or violence against women?
That's a good question. I know that a way that I have seen that I've been very inspired about is something called called Where Love is Illegal. You can go and search on Google where love is illegal. I think it has a hashtag as well. And that's basically a movement started by a photojournalist who went out to do portraits of people who are not allowed to be gay or another way not fitting into the normal ideas of how to be together as or how to be as a human being sexual wise. And I think in that way he has done a photo essay of people who he have portrait about, and they could tell their stories. In many ways, I think that very violent pictures and very disturbing pictures is a very dangerous way to go downwards, because when you publish it in a media, a lot of people who are sitting back home in their normal everyday life usually tend to kind of push these strong images away and say, we don't want to look into this, or oh, the world is bad, and what can I do? I think a better way is to kind of show less violent images, but kind of try to reach into people's life and inviting them into looking at these people's stories. So in many ways, if we see strong images, it's a way of pushing people away. But if we show very beautiful, and you can see where love is illegal, it's photographed very beautifully. And I think that's a movement that starts and inspire other people around the world to take a selfie, write their own stories under the hashtag where love is illegal, and then they can share their stories. So in many ways, strong images, as I said before, it's you should be very careful about pushing that into people's faces, because they can make a very big distance between their normal life and the actual reality, even though we think that we need to show the world how bad this is. But studies have shown that it's not always the case. It's not always the strong images that actually encourage people to do something about it. There must be many cases where it's the actual opposite, where strong images have actually changed people's life. But in many ways, if we ask people how do they read the media, what do they think about seeing photos as this? Also, as I told before, my friend, when he saw all my pictures of children who was very sick from needing basically food and clean water, he couldn't deal with it. He just pushed it away. But when there came a picture that kind of surprised him, like, how can it be that they're standing there in suits and looking good? That in that way he started to be curious, and in that way I also made him go into this world that I wanted to show him. And later on, I could start showing him pictures that was very strong to look at, but he had a much better idea of what the reality was actually about. I hope that was an answer you can use in some way.
Thank you, Daniel. I think people are interested to know more about the handling subjects. Let us move on to the next question. This is also related to the subject. How can we capture an image while not disrupting the private space of the subject? How to approach them? This is the question.
I think what I did when I did the story about Mr. Condisa was that I did not go down there and just started to photograph him and publish photos of a man I barely knew. I kind of moved into his life, and I started to be a part of his life. In that way, he gained trust in me as a photographer and a journalist. And in that way, there was no questioning about whether I should be there or not. He was such a big part of my story that he invited me into to places where I was not allowed to be if I wasn't accepted by the local community. So I think when we do subjects that are very that are really touching and tense, I think it's very important to not think that you can do this in 3 days or in 1 week, but you need to go back there and again and again and again to follow up on the stories and gain the trust of the people that you are photographing, but because if you do that, they will help you and they will accept you. And in that way, when you publish pictures of them, also in vulnerable situations, you will have their blessings doing that. And I think that's very important, because right now journalism in Denmark it's not very trustworthy. We are very low when it comes to trust. We are right on the side of politicians and people who sell used cars. So we have to change that way of not being hypocrites who wants to just drag people's a bad situation and make a living of that. But we have to go in there and be a part of their life and take them into our sides and gain their trust and interest in also telling their own story to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Next, we have a question related to your personal life experience. This is the question. So, what was going through your mind when you were kidnapped by the terror group?
A lot of things was going through my mind. At that time when I was kidnapped, there was no really such thing as Islamic State. We didn't really know what that terror group was. It was in the spring of 2013. It was first a year later when I was released that we actually knew what this group was all about. So a lot of things went through my mind. And if you are interested in my story, it's in a book called The ISIS Hostage on English, and there is made a movie about it called it's Danish and it's a small production, so it could be difficult for you to find, but it's called Do You See the Moon, Daniel, which is the Danish title of the book. Ser du månen, Daniel? And there you can read my full story, see the full story of what I went through. But basically, I knew that being kidnapped is a part of our job, almost. Not many places in the world they make life very easy for journalists, and therefore we have to be very careful on where we go and how we prepare ourselves. And also when I went to Malawi, I was really careful that I didn't piss anybody off. So that's also why I wanted to go back to the same place again and again, gain their trust. And whenever I gained their trust in Malawi, in Kakoma, they started to also kind of trying to protect me towards other people who didn't know who I was, who don't think I should be there. They went in and they said, hey, it's okay, he's with us, he's doing a great job. So yeah, in that way, going slow by slow into communities, understand the communities, understand the people, what are their interests, what do they, if there is anything they don't want you to do, kind of try to be an expert on the subject. Is not, I think it's the best way of protecting yourself in many ways, but always you cannot predict the world. It's changing very fast. And there will always be an opportunity, a possibility for journalists to end up in very, very bad situations, because that's what we do. We are trying to show the world things that somebody don't think that we should look into, but it doesn't mean that we have to stop doing what we're doing, because then things will start to take a very bad turn. I think that journalism right now, more than ever, is so important to tell the world what's actually going on and give a voice to those who is not able to speak up for themselves.
Daniel, I think participants are more interested in photojournalism. They are asking more questions. Let us move on to the next question, please.
That's
Yes,
the last
yes.
questions, because in
Sure,
15
sure.
minutes I have to do another lecture across the street, and the whole office went away. So last question will be short, and then sadly I have to leave.
Sure, sure. This is our last question. How do you feel about the regulations of social media and its effects on journalism? I think you can speak on the basis of photojournalism.
I think that mainly that the social media is a very toxic world, but it also has a lot of opportunities. So basically, you can decide not to deal with it, or you can try to use it for yourself. And there I would like to give a word into what I told you about before, where love is illegal, the hashtag, the movement, the webpage. In that way, I think they managed to use social media for their advantages to spread the word on something that is so important for people to look into, and to kind of engage not only your own country but the rest of the world in that. You're not the only one who is facing a problem. Go in, do a hashtag, put a selfie, write your story, and suddenly you have a bright audience, and movements can be made on the fundamentals of a photojournalism project. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel, for having such a wonderful time, and you have answered all the questions. And now HOD Manjuna will start.
Thank you so much, and have a great day, all of you.
And that was a great session. Thanks for the great session, Daniel. And great to know about how you have documented the ability of a small family in Malawi to adapt the extreme unpredictability of climate change. It's the story of everyday survival in the time of extreme drought and devastating flood. The photos are brilliant and powerful. It is essential to document such stories of survival in trying time. We look forward to have more sessions with you in the future. We appreciate your willingness to come live for this webinar. And thank you very much for joining us, and especially at a time when you just had a newborn baby, and special love and regards for the little one. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day.
Welcome. Our next speaker is Renee Karunankan. Renee is a climate journalist, campaigner, activist, and communication researcher from the Philippines. She has been involved in the climate justice movement since 2009 and has worked for organizations as Dakila, Climate Tracker, and Tintel Center for Climate Change and Research. Renee is currently doctoral researcher in political communication at Loughborough University, United Kingdom. She did her post-graduation in media and international development from University of East Anglia. She is a freelance journalist and has published and presented on climate change and human rights issues in Asia and globally. In 2018, she presented at the Cambridge Climate Series of lecture at Cambridge University, where she talked about engaging youth for climate change. In 2017, Renee published an environmental children's book, Where Did All the Fireflies Go? Listed as one of the best Filipino children's book of 2017. Title of her session is Capitalizing on Fear or Hope. How do we communicate climate change? Welcome, Renee.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for making it to this webinar we have today. And I would like to thank the university as well for inviting me. And so today I'm going to talk about more on evidence-based approach on how do we actually communicate climate change through photography or climate visuals. And my title is Capitalizing on Fear or Hope, because a lot of photography or climate visuals we see these days are sometimes extreme. So sometimes it's always we want to communicate tragedies and disasters, or sometimes on the other hand it's just we want to communicate hopefulness to the world. And so there needs to be something in between fear and hope, because too much fear will actually stop people from engaging, because it makes them feel like they're helpless, that they can't do anything more. And meanwhile, too much hope shields us from the reality of the impacts of climate change. So I will start by sharing my screen. start my presentation. Great. I hope everyone can see my screen. So, as I said, we are now going to talk about how do we effectively communicate climate change through photography. So let's start with why photography. Why is climate visuals important? And I would like to say that there is a lot of power in images. You know, sometimes words aren't enough, and we have to rely on images to make sense of the things around us. And according to Helen Joff, a psychology professor at University College London, the power of photography is that it is vivid, it is emotive, it draws on the audience, and it makes it memorable for them. Next, there's also a study by an American psychologist, Robert Sajong, and he says that sometimes hard data and statistics are important in communicating the facts, but people can be tired of this. You know, there's such a thing as data fatigue or statistics fatigue, and they simply do not do the job in persuading people to act. So imagine we read a lot of news about climate change, you know, how many acres of land will be lost because of climate change, or how many people will be climate refugees. But sometimes the numbers are too big and we can't imagine this. And sometimes they're too far away from us. And so we can't see clearly, you know, what does this mean? What does this data mean? So what with photography, we can convey how it actually feels, how it actually sounds, or how it actually looks. Visuals strike more emotively than numbers. And so the right use of images will affect people's perception on climate change and what they want to do about it. So this is why we have to learn, you know, what is an effective visual. And most of my talk today will be from a research by Climate Outreach, who's done a very, very good research on asking the audience, what makes you want to engage with climate change? What makes you want to stop engaging in climate change? So not all kinds of images are actually effective. So later on, we will see, are protest images actually effective? You know, what kind of politician images do we use if we need to use one? So we'll talk more about this. Okay, so currently, according to research, there are 4 types of climate visuals. The first type are climate impacts, and we see this almost every day. You know, it's a drought, fires. Currently, the California wildfires are all over the news. Typhoons, polar ice caps melting, flooding, etc. So that's the first one. The second one, it's the climate solutions. So the solutions to climate change. So solar panels, renewable energy, wind turbines, gardening, sustainable farming, etc., etc. The third one are climate causes. So what's caused climate change? So usually we see fossil fuels, coal-fired power plants, pollution, polluted cities, etc. So these are also some of the images that we constantly see in the news. And then the last one, and maybe less familiar, it's called the news stories. So these are more thought-provoking and can help tell a news story about climate change. So usually these are stories of everyday climate solutions or everyday lives that we don't really see in the big news or in mainstream media. And on the next slide, I will show you an example of these photographs. So the first one, climate impact. So as you can see, this is a wildfire. This is from Australia. And currently in the news, if you've seen going around in international news, the California wildfires are actually, you know, all over. So that's an example of climate impact. Second one is climate solution. So here you can see a photo of a woman climbing to adjust a solar panel in her community. And if you can see in this photo, it's actually not just a climate solution, but you can see how powerful it is because it's an everyday woman, you know, it's not an engineer. It's can be your neighbor, can be your sister, and trying to do something, for her community. The third one is called climate causes. So as you can see in the background, I believe this is in China, you can see coal-fired power plants polluting in the background. And this is an example of a climate cause photograph. Sometimes you'll see other causes, but mostly you'll see these coal-fired power plants. And then the last one, as I said earlier, is the news stories. So for news stories, this one, for example, you won't see every day in the news, but it tells something different. It tells something new. So in this photograph, you can see a vertical garden in a building. And this is kind of like a new solution to city pollution, for example, in reducing carbon emissions in a community or in a city. So that kind of photography is rare, but can be impactful as well. So what are the 8 principles of climate visuals? What makes climate change photographs effective? And again, this is based on evidence. This is based on research. So first one, we should hook your audience. What does that mean? So we should captivate the viewer's attention right from the get-go. Powerful visuals, powerful images. We have to remember that we are visual animals, and our understanding of the world is dominated by what we see and how this makes us feel. Okay. The second principle is to show real people and not staged photo ops. So we want to use authentic images. We don't want to use staged ones. It doesn't connect very well with the audience. It feels fake. People's presence is also important. Pictures or visuals with only a few people or a few animals than larger groups are actually best. People connect more to individuals or fewer people than a large group. Direct eye contact that doesn't look staged is okay. And credibility is also important, which means that politicians should be avoided because a lot of times the audience that we want to talk to don't trust politicians. But if our story, for example, is about policy making, or it's an important news about a politician, make sure that the photo isn't staged. You don't ask the politician or the politicians to pose for you. It needs to still be authentic. So the third one is to tell news stories. So the easily recognizable or the more common images that we see on media are polar bears, wildfires, melting ice caps. Okay, so these are what we see all the time. But these kinds of images only tend to engage audiences with little interest in climate change. And these images also evoke the most climate fatigue and cynicism in the research. Not because if we keep using the same images over and over again, the audience, the people, the public will be tired of it eventually. We need to show them something new, something they haven't seen before. And if you look at this, polar bears, for example, it's so far away from Asia, it's so far away from India, it's even far away from where I am in the UK. Like, I haven't seen any polar bear. I mean, they're cute and we feel bad for the polar bears, but eventually these images just go out of our mind. We tend to forget about them and we don't engage about them. It's like, oh, the polar bears are sad and they're going to die, but how does that affect me? It doesn't engage me as a person, and a lot of the audience feels the same. The next one is show climate causes at scale. So we have to make visual choices that show behaviors at scale rather than individuals. For example, eating meat, show environmental impacts of industrial animal agriculture. Rather than a driver filling up a gas tank, show the destructive environmental consequences of our fossil fuel society. So the last thing we want to do is to blame individuals with our individual actions. Okay, the principle of climate justice is that, we recognize that those who have polluted more aren't individuals. Our individual footprints aren't as big as fossil fuel companies or cement companies, for example, who have been burning and extracting fossil fuels for decades. So, our research show that they're actually the ones who need to be accountable to us. And so, if we keep on blaming individuals will start feeling like, well, if you keep blaming me, what can I do about it? So we need to show climate causes at scale. Next one, emotionally intense climate impact images only work with practical guidance on actions. So the research is clear. Climate visuals that show emotionally powerful images of climate impacts compel people to respond. So for example, a lot of tragedies, we see a lot of donations, for example, celebrities suddenly wanting to donate lots of money, or we can ask ourselves, what can I do to help? But at the same time, these images create a counter emotion, feelings of helplessness and resignation. So as I said earlier, if these images keep bombarding us, then we just feel helpless and we feel resigned. It's like, I've done what I could, but it's still happening. So what else could I do? And eventually, if this fatigue takes over, people also stop engaging. So climate visuals of impacts need to be coupled somehow with guidance on concrete actions people can take. So, a good call to action, for example, is what can you caption your photo with, what can you do at home, or what can you do as an individual to respond to these tragedies or to these impacts. Okay, and then next, we have to show local but serious climate impacts. So local scenes, especially those that we are familiar with, can evoke a greater resonance with people who are from the same place and from people who know these people from this place. Yeah, so for example, if I see a typhoon or a tragedy in Asia, it makes me feel really connected to the image, because I am from Asia and I know and I've felt the impacts of climate change in Asia. But if you show me melting ice caps, for example, near the Arctic or the Antarctic, for example, in Peru, although these images are really nice, I really couldn't connect very well because I didn't grow up in a country where there are ice caps. So local images can have more impact within the local community. So images of local climate impacts, including individuals with identifiable emotions, are the most powerful in research on climate visuals. So remember, this is the most effective, most engaging kind of photography that you can show to your audience. Next, be extra careful with protest imagery. So I know that there's a lot of protests going around right now. And especially with climate change, there's Fridays for a Future, where children go out every Friday to protest. There's the Extinction Rebellion protests, etc., etc. But you have to be careful with the use of protest imagery, because they only resonate with people who are identified as environmental activists. So some people who don't like activism or who don't like to be involved in this kind of thing are actually turned off with this kind of images. You can't engage with people who are not already part of the group. So you have to choose images and video involving people directly affected by climate impacts. So for example, if you want to photograph protest image, if there is an indigenous woman in the protest, maybe that's more powerful than taking a photo of the whole group, because then there's more of a story there that we haven't seen before or that hasn't been told before. and it might connect more to your audience than taking just a whole group photo of protesters. Climate justice frames are generally viewed negatively by those on the right side of this political spectrum. Just a point to keep in mind if that's the audience you're trying to reach. So take into consideration who you are communicating to. Are we preaching to the choir, or do we want to communicate and converse with someone who don't really usually believe in climate change, for example? You know, do you show Donald Trump a photo of a protesting climate change or his climate change uh, act? I don't think so, because Donald Trump will just be like, why are you showing me pictures of protests? I hate protesters, right? So we have to be extra careful about protest imagery and who we share it with. Next is we understand our audience and their politics. So you have to constantly ask yourself, who is your audience and do you know their politics? You know, this is connected to the principle earlier I was talking about. So, a large body of research show that people's political beliefs drive how they engage with the issue of climate change. And this includes not just their political beliefs, but their value system as an individual. You know, if you're a conservative, right wing individual, you'll view climate change differently as someone who's in the climate justice movement. So you have to know who are we talking to. Knowing our target audience, and therefore who we are trying to persuade and what we are asking them to do, will enhance the effectiveness of your visual choices. Okay, so I'm going into my last slide. So this is a quote from O'Neill and Cole, who are also climate change communicators and researchers. They say that climate change images that take into account a person's values, attitudes, belief, local environment, and experiences are important in creating meaningful engagement. So you always have to remember who your audience is, what they believe in, what their environment is. And then when you take a photo, ask yourself, is this what they want to see? All right, thank you very much. And if you want to connect with me, this is my email, my Twitter, and my website. And I would be glad to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Renee, for the great perspective. Our moderator, Tara CB, will ask you the questions of our audience.
Hello, Renee. I'm Tara Ravishankar. I'll be moderating the questions. Due to time constraints, we'll be picking only a few questions. And moreover, Archana Sarang, she is a bit busy and she couldn't stay with us after 9:25 Indian time. So move on to our first question. How much do you feel that how much do you feel that when people see what climate change is through climate photography will change their perspective on climate and act upon it? How much do you feel that when people see what climate change is through climate photography will change their perspective on climate and act upon it? Hope you got the question. Renee, can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me? Have you got the question? Should I repeat it? Hello? Shall I repeat the question, Rini? This is your question. How much do you feel that when people see what climate change is through climate photography will change their perspective on climate and act upon it?
Hello.
Hello, Rini.
Hiya. Can you
Got
hear
the
me?
question?
Yeah. No. I got the question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'll answer very quickly. So I was saying earlier that we don't have control over other people's behavior. So the best we can do is tell our stories through photography. And hope for the best that they will act on it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. It depends on, as I said, the kind of person they are, the kind of stories we tell. And the best we can do is tell the best stories we can.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Anyway, I'll hand over my mic to Manju ma'am.
Thank you, Renee. So there are a lot of questions. We'll be mailing it to you. As you said, it is essential to engage young people in the climate change discussion. Young people will surely be affected more with the climate change. Photojournalism as a tool can significantly support for mobilizing support for policy change and decision-making process. Thank you for your time and best wishes for your research on political communication. Using Facebook for winning national elections is a great topic. That's for another day. We look forward to having you again as a speaker. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tara Pixley. Dr. Tara Pixley is a photojournalist, documentary maker, and professor with a 20-year career in visual journalism. Dr. Pixley is based in Los Angeles, where she teaches journalism and media studies at Loyola Marymount University. She is a recipient of inaugural World Press Photo Award, Solution Journalism Network's Solutions Visual Journalism Initiative grant, and completed a visiting night fellowship at prestigious Harvard University Neyman Foundation for Journalism. Her writing and photography have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Newsweek, ProPublica, HuffPost, Neiman Reports, ESPN magazines, Canon Pro, and Black Scholar. Tara's film and photographic work intersect with her scholarship and advocacy, each addressing the problematics of representation and the possibility of contemporary visual media to reimagine marginalized communities. She is co-founder and board member of Authority Collective, an organization dedicated to diversifying perspectives in visual media. And she is currently working on a book chronicling the move to decolonize the visual journalism industry. Title of the session is Visualizing Solutions, Telling Complex Stories. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you so much. And hello to everyone watching today. Thank you all for being here with us. And thank you to my fellow presenters. I love listening to your research and your experiences. And I'm going to build a little off of some of the things that you've already heard today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. To add a little bit of context to that, my work in photojournalism has shifted over the years as I worked as a photo editor in international or for international news organizations. I began to realize that we were missing some stories, or we were missing rather the complexity of certain visual narratives that we were telling in our photojournalistic coverage of the most important issues of our day. And part of why that was happening is because I believe rather, part of why that was happening is because we didn't have as diverse of a of a group of photojournalists that would allow for far more diverse visual perspectives and a diversity of lived experiences that inform the work that we do. And as I started to notice that, I began to think about how do we include, or how do we rather achieve that diversity of visual narratives and include far more diverse approaches to visual storytelling. And so I decided to get my PhD in communication so that I could think more deeply about these issues and write about them, as well as continue my work as a visual journalist. And that is what led me ultimately to solutions journalism and solutions visual journalism. I started to think that perhaps this emphasis on the negative imagery, this sort of like gloom and doom, wasn't working. It didn't inspire people to feel that they can address these issues. It doesn't necessarily give the complexity and a holistic representation of what is happening in these contemporary issues. And that's where I think solutions journalism specifically can be really impactful. I'm going to start my presentation. Can everyone see that? Okay. I looked up the best of photojournalism, and this is what Google Images suggested. A majority of these photos, like most photojournalism, depicts tragedy, chaos, devastation, or death. And this is what people expect documentary images to show them, I think. And this is often what our photojournalistic industry awards. It's what we model our own work after when we are aspiring or emerging photojournalists. When you see that these are the kinds of images that win awards, this is the way to approach storytelling, then that becomes replicated, reproduced over and over again. But as we have, some of our other speakers have touched on, that isn't what gets people to respond to the problems of climate change, the problems that Daniel spoke to. People often respond better, and audiences respond better to images that they can connect with. And while it's important to see and recognize the severity and the sort of impact of these world issues, we also need to help people feel empowered. Studies indicate that 48% of people avoid news because it's so negative. That's a Reuters Institute digital news report from 2017. So that's almost half of news audiences that are saying they're avoiding news because it's too negative. People respond more positively to news coverage that highlights what people can do to respond to a problem, or what people are doing, rather than focusing specifically on the problem itself or only on the problem itself. It gives us a sense of power over those issues of our world, and it provides a roadmap for how we become engaged, how to think about potential solutions. Visual storytelling has power. So solutions journalism has power because of the things I just spoke to, and visual storytelling has power. Visual coverage is essential to reporting news. People often notice photos first and remember them the most. We're drawn in by images. So combining that power of a solutions journalism approach, and combining the power of visual storytelling to engage audiences and engage our public, is a really powerful and incredible opportunity to sort of realize photojournalism's core tenets. And I believe that photos should tell complex stories. I'm going to go to the next slide, but I'll explain these images more in a moment. I believe photos should tell complex stories, and that our mission is to inspire deeper empathy between audiences and the lived experiences of those photographed. We can't really convey the lived experience of people. We can't really tell those complex stories if we aren't engaging what's happening to people beyond the issue itself. And I believe that photos can evince empathy in audiences as well. Photojournalists often seek to connect people worlds away from each other. We, as Renee was saying, we often, I have never seen a polar bear, unfortunately. And while I might love to see polar bears, and or I might be affected and impacted by seeing polar bears in distress or in danger due to climate change, I can't connect with it and on the same level. I need the surrounding context to make it impactful, more impactful for me. And that's true of most stories that we tell. We need to find ways to connect people to what is happening worlds away from them so that they understand, they see themselves. There's sympathy where you recognize the sorrow of another, and there's empathy where you actually feel it, where you can connect what is happening to someone else to what has happened or could happen to you. That is empathy, and that is ultimately, or should be rather, the goal of photojournalism. And photos often act as evidence. So visual perception theory tells us that we often believe what we see above other information. Our eyes are connected to our cognitive reasoning in particular ways, and visual information gets sort of put above other forms of information. So telling true stories through images can convey meaning that provide the necessary evidence to understand a problem is real and that it must be addressed. I believe the solutions approach to visual journalism can provide that additional context that I said is important, a holistic and thorough engagement with the individuals, with the communities, and the environments that we cover as photographers. That produces the kind of knowledge on issues that motivates action in audiences. And I believe that is what we are striving to do as photojournalists. If we're taking images, if we're photographing and documenting the world's most pressing issues, the most important news stories, why would we do that work if we weren't hoping that our images would create the impact that might affect change on these issues? We aren't doing it just, for our own edification. We aren't doing it just because we enjoy photographing tragedy or sorrow or problems. We're doing it because we hope that it will spur people to act. And if we want people to feel like they can act, then we have to, again, give them this sense of empowerment, this recognition of what can be done. We have to introduce them to the solutions. So a solutions-focused visual story seeks to explain that underlying problem and portray existing responses to those problems. It also provides a framework for the viewing public that may inspire and empower further change making, right? Which again is the goal. And another thing that's very important to me is that a solutions approach can avoid relying on stereotypes. It's very easy for us to kind of focus on this simplistic othering of people in our images, of blank-faced people of color as the sort of de facto image to illustrate a human rights issue. Portraying expressionless faces in far-flung places does not actually make change. It doesn't inspire people. It doesn't make an impact in the same way that photos of more holistic lived experience does. And images of graphic and horrific violence don't inspire, again, that lasting and change-making empathy at the level that other kinds of imagery can and do. So neither of these kinds of photographs either kind of move forward an understanding of what's being done to address the problem. And I say that solutions visual journalism expands our visual narrative. In order to tell stories accurately and truthfully, we need to move beyond that kind of victim or victimization of particular individuals, a victim narrative of individuals or communities. And we should begin by understanding that the topics and communities we portray, moving outside of that kind of understanding of people as subjects and thinking more about them as fellow humans, and what kind of stories would we want to be told about ourselves when we're having, when we're in spaces of chaos or devastation. Exemplary journalism highlights the commonalities between human struggles, and solutions journalism unpacks attempts to mitigate those struggles. A successful visual journalist working in the solutions journalism framework will recognize shared humanity and strive to emphasize that in their image. Additionally, we should always be providing very thorough and contextualizing captions that give our audiences a real understanding of what is happening, why is it happening, what is it related to. So these images that I'm showing here are actually from the project I'm working on with the World Press Photo Solutions Journalism Initiative grant that I received. And unfortunately, it's a little bit on hold right now due to COVID, or it has been rather for the last 6 months. I'm hoping to be able to return to Tijuana and have the ability to cross the border and continue photographing communities there. But just to give a little bit of context, In December 2018, these two photos you see here from December 2018, I decided to go down. I live in Los Angeles, and at the time I lived in San Diego, and I decided to go to Tijuana and photograph what was happening at the border. I had several colleagues and friends who were working as activists and migrant advocates there when one of the largest migrant caravans out of Central America had finally come to the border, the US-Mexico border. And so there were several thousand people who came in that migrant caravan in late 2018. And those people were not allowed to cross the border. They were kind of stuck in Tijuana and at various other cities along the US-Mexico border. And they were in dire straits. There was not a lot of food for them. There was not a lot of resources. They were being kind of contextualized in American news media as, rather than contextualized as refugees, they were contextualized as terrorists or criminals, people who were trying to invade America. And that was just factually inaccurate. These were people who were fleeing danger, who were fleeing gang violence, starvation, climate change that was pushing them out of being able to, kind of feed their families and things like that. And I'm always interested in the work of activists, how those actions take form, what changes it seeks to enact, and what actions and interventions are made. And so I decided to come to Tijuana, excuse me, to photograph what was happening here at El Baratal shelter. And that's what's pictured here. So these are images of a day I spent with a dance company, Contratiempo dance company, that is based out of LA. They came down to Tijuana to visit and work with some of the migrants and asylees, the people who are seeking asylum. And their goal was to engage them in dance, to engage them in aerial yoga, as you see here, and to sort of offer them a connectivity. The Contratiempo dancers and the dance company, they spoke about it as bringing radical joy, the possibility of experiencing joy, even in dire circumstances, even in this really bad or negative experience that many of the people, the migrants, were having. And so these are images. This one is Contratiempo dancers leading a crowd of migrants and asylees in bachata and salsa dance circles. And the dancers also brought clothing, money, and other resources to provide to the asylees and the migrants. So they came with the kind of material resources that these people needed, and they came with the goal of relating to them as humans, as fellow humans, as people who need to dance, who need to sing, who need to feel seen as something other than a victim. And I wanted to photograph this happening to try and understand and to visualize what it means to bring radical joy to a community of people, to a community of refugees. I was hoping to find that there might be a visual narrative beyond the kind of typical narrative that we see of migrants and refugees, and that I might be able to capture some component of a solution here. And I use the term solution with this particular project sort of tentatively, because the term solution implies something that we know is absolutely solving the problem. We know that it works, we have data on it. And I can't say that about this particular work. I think this is something that we'll see over time. But solutions, visual journalism, doesn't only need to be validated by data or proof of the efficacy of, or the effectiveness of a particular solution or approach. It can also be validated by the lived experience, by the commentary and feedback of those you were photographing. And what I found when I was photographing, what I found when I was photographing the migrants this day in December 2018, as I spoke to them, is that they were relaying that they had this experience of radical joy, that they had this experience of being connected to. And they said that no one had done this for them. People came and brought food, they brought money, they brought clothing, they brought supplies, and that's wonderful and important and absolutely necessary. But very few people beyond these particular activists and artists, very few people brought an opportunity for them to laugh, to dance, to be together in this way that made them feel engaged and recognized beyond the idea of a victim. And so that is what created this project for me, where I wanted to photograph and focus on, or visualize rather, through images and film, how activists and advocates, and there's a kind of extensive network of people, including lawyers and various advocacy organizations and individuals who are working to produce and provide the resources that these asylees need. So it's now 2020. Many of these people, still hundreds and hundreds of Central American migrants, are at the border in Tijuana and other cities, still waiting to have their asylum cases processed, still in a lot of danger and precarity. And there's still quite a bit of scarcity of resources. And my project began to photograph on a particular shelter in Tijuana called the Casa de Luz shelter. And Casa de Luz is unique in that it brings together people from the LGBTQ community, so lesbian, gay, transgender people, alongside women or mothers and their children. So it's families and LGBTQ. And in Mexico, the Mexican government doesn't typically allow any mixing of groups like that in shelters. But what that actually produces is this sort of lack of community, lack of consistency across the shelters. Casa de Luz, by bringing together these two different communities, they've created a sort of wonderful family and community that shares resources. They eat together and cook together, and they live together in this space, and they have very little. It's quite a space of precarity, in fact, but photographing them has given me the opportunity to see that this kind of community focused work and community engagement in terms of advocacy and a network of support is producing really positive results. That even as people are struggling, many of the trans women who are at this particular shelter are frequently attacked and harassed by Mexican police. They're often, they have their asylum paperwork torn up and thrown out. They are followed and arrested for the offense of walking down the street. And so they're having things like this happening, but they always have this home to return to. And then they have people there who are working across the border to help them get asylum, to when they do actually are allowed across the border into America, then there are people on the other side of the border who are helping them with their cases there, who are following them for several months or even years at this point to make sure that they're okay. And while again, this is not a solution to a migrant, the influx of migrants, it's not a solution to the masses of asylees whose plights are being ignored, who are being turned away. It isn't a solution, but it is a possible intervention. It is a way in which we can reimagine our visual representation and our visual narratives about migrants and asylees. And one of the things I had the privilege of doing was spending some time in December 2019 at Casa de Luz with the families and individuals staying there. And they were having a posada, a celebration around Christmas time. And so they were all cooking food together. They had this piñata, rainbow piñata, for the children to play with, and seeing again, that community, that connection, the way that they are coming together despite, very unfortunate and difficult circumstances, and still finding a way to express their humanity, to be in relation to one another and have that radical joy. That's what I wanted to capture in my images. This is Irving. He's one of the people who run the shelter, and he is he's a Mexican citizen who is also gay or identifies as part of the LGBTQ community. And when he saw what was happening with the migrant caravan, he started to help people, and he started to also reach out to various different organizations and individuals and helped bring them all together. And so I'm not highlighting him here because he's just one component of this larger network of people identifying solutions and interventions to this problem. But he is, I think, an important part of the story in how he's representing, not exemplary, he's representing the ways in which average people can affect change and be creating that change with very little resources by producing a community of support. And that is the emphasis of this project, is how community itself can be a solution. And here's another image from the Posada at Casa de Luz. Oh, I don't know what happened. Oh, here. Sorry. And another thing that I think is really important is the way that single mothers and mothers with children are protected, taken care of, and resourced through Casa de Luz. This is an image of a woman who had her baby actually just a few weeks after this photo was taken. It intended to photograph the baby, but due to COVID have not been able to, so the baby might be a toddler by the time I get to actually go there and see her. And this is an image again from the El Barretol shelter. It struck me, and this is the first time that I went to Tijuana and was photographing migrants and asylees there. And it struck me that this woman was holding this flag. I didn't tell her to do this. I just saw this moment and wanted to capture it. And that there were hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 people at this shelter. They didn't have food or running water, or they didn't have consistent food rather, and other necessities that they really needed. And yet the people I saw at this shelter were hopeful, were not just victims. They were not just struggling to survive. They were surviving, and they were doing that in a way that I found beautiful and incredible, and that I had not seen photographed and captured and kind of publicized and circulated via mainstream news media. And so that is the work that I try to do as a visual journalist, focusing on using a solutions focus, is how do we tell these more complex stories? How do we go away from relying on that victim narrative? How do we go away from relying on stereotypes, from always focusing on the sort of gloom and doom images, the worst possible, showcasing the worst things that are happening, and not pretend that that's not happening. I'm not saying that we should ignore the severity of the issues. We should also include this representation of people's humanity. We should try to understand and include how we got here. A good solutions journalism approach shows the connection and humanity behind the typical images we see of impoverished and devastated migrants or other people. It changes that visual narrative, shows how people are combating these issues of human rights and creating a supportive network with one another, or at least that's what I'm showing in this particular story. And so I know this is a brief overview, but I just wanted to kind of talk through how we can imagine our focus on solutions visual journalism, how we can, again, tell those complex stories as we try to visualize a different way of engaging the most important and pressing issues of our time. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Thara. Now, our moderator. Here we also have a Thara. So, our moderator, Thara CB, will do the question answer session with Thara Pixley.
Hello, I'm happy to see another Tara from another part of the world. And myself will be moderating these questions. Okay, shall I share the screen? With the advent of smartphones or social media, the reporting giving people, especially from marginalized community, their stories, they are reporting stories from the ground. And what place does the photojournalism take in future?
Thank you. That's a great question. This is something I actually talk a lot about with my students. I also teach as a professor, I teach journalism. And the thing is, for a very long time, journalists have had a monopoly on information. And that can be, no monopoly is good. It was important to have factual information, fact-checked information based on evidence. But now we've kind of lost that monopoly. And I think that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to see the world in different ways, to hear a lot of different voices and perspectives. It's also an unfortunate opportunity for misrepresentation and misinformation. But we need to recognize and understand that the professional photojournalistic approach is important, and the approach of citizen journalists, of the public, photographing, documenting, and publicizing their own lived experiences and relationship to news events, that's just as important. I think both of them need to happen, because even though the average, I hate to say average, even though every citizen or the public's images and documentation of their everyday lives or of particular news issues is also very important, they don't have the same access and professionalization and ethical code that photojournalists have. I, as a freelance photojournalist working for a major news organization, I have the ability to get entree into particular rooms, particular spaces that not everyone can do. And it's also my focus, my emphasis, right? So if I were a chef or a firefighter, or I might be able to certainly take great images of what's happening in my restaurant or as I fight wildfires, but I won't have the kind of time to really dig into and focus in depth on that story. So I think that these two things work together, and that we as photojournalists should not, as all journalists, we shouldn't be afraid of the proliferation of information online. We shouldn't be afraid of citizen journalists. We should be welcoming. We should encourage people to adhere to the same kinds of ethical standards and codes, and to make sure that the information they're circulating is true.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the next question? Here's the next question. How journalists are showcasing violence in the streets of America due to the racial hatred. How can solutions journalism help here?
Thank you for that question. I actually was going to include some of my protest images in this presentation, and I decided against it. I thought I might not have time. But I think that the reason why I wanted to include that is because we are seeing quite a lot of images that highlight the violence and the rage, the police brutality, and that is absolutely a part of the story. I am a first-generation American. My family is Jamaican, and I, as a first-generation American, am both very. It is very important to me to be politically active in this country, and to also recognize the limitations of our political sphere. To critique, I think, our nations is to show how much we actually love them, because we want them to be better. And I think about that all the time in my work as a photojournalist. That's part of what led me to do the work of journalism, is that I wanted to be able to showcase what is happening and provide a perspective that I was not seeing. And so I say all of that to bring attention to my approach when I'm going to photograph protests in Los Angeles. I photographed protests from May 30th to June 30th. I haven't been back out to photograph protests recently because frankly, I needed a little bit of a break. But what I was seeing in the streets was again, that sense of community, that connection between people who have been experiencing racism, who've been experiencing police brutality their whole lives, and their allies, people who haven't necessarily experienced that personally, but who recognize that that is real, that it's happening, and that we collectively have to speak back against that kind of misuse of power. And so seeing, hundreds to thousands of people gathering in the streets of Los Angeles peacefully and speaking out against this thing that they think, needs to stop. But then going home, that's what I'm seeing personally as I attend and photograph it. And then I go home and I see the front page of newspapers, what's highlighted on CNN, Fox News, etc., is just the violence. And that violence is such a small portion of what's actually happening. So that brings me back to that importance of telling complex stories, of having a holistic visual narrative and not relying on the sort of easy, victimization, the sort of easy representation of fear and hatred and violence and sort of chaos. That's what we often get drawn to visually because it seems impactful, it seems really important, but it's not the whole story. And so I think that what photojournalists should be doing is acknowledging that, representing it when it happens, but also highlighting the importance of all of these other things that are going on. That is how we're going to tell that more accurate story of what's happening in the streets of America.
Though we have a lot of questions, we are moving to the last question due to time constraints. This is your last question. Does photos which can be connected towards personal life of a viewer in public will have much more impact in that person's perspective? Thus, photos which can be connected towards personal life of a viewer in the public will have much more impact in that person's perspective.
Okay, thank you. So I think what this question is asking is if we have photos that represent the sort of, the personal relationships, the sort of background experiences that isn't just highlighting the struggles itself, will that connect more with people in the public? And I think the answer to that is yes. We have a lot of studies that show that people experience empathy when they can actually, as I was saying before, when they can actually recognize something in that story, in that image that they connect with personally. And so if we're thinking about that, whether we're in a conflict zone, whether we're photographing the aftermath of a tornado, hurricane, an earthquake, or starvation, people are experiencing drought, famine, things like that. These unfortunate and tragic things happen all around the world all the time. And photojournalism is supposed to photograph that. But, as Daniel mentioned in his talk, that when he was showing his images with that particular project, the thing that connected someone more than any of those other images of, the kind of struggle and strife that this farmer was experiencing were the two photos of the children in the suits. It's things like that that take us out of our, existing preconceptions, our existing notions of what tragedy and victims look like, and actually connect us to that personal life. Of people who are, everybody wants to look good for a picture, or everyone wants to get dressed up to go do whatever it is, to go to worship or to be, to a dinner. So those are things that we can photograph and capture in conjunction with all these other things that are happening that will be a kind of hook for someone that will say, oh, I just did that last night, or I dressed my children up in a suit as well, and I'm 20,000 miles away from this person, but now I have this connection to them, to what they do, to the life that they're living, to who they are. And I can see myself, my own children, my neighbors, my parents, my friends, my colleagues, whoever it is, I can see them in this person that I'm looking at. And so now they are more humanized to me. They're more human rather than this sort of dehumanizing of images of tragedy. What they produce is a sort of dehumanization. It produces a sort of like us versus them. I've never experienced that. They are experiencing that. How very sad for them, but I can't relate to it. And that's not the same. Again, that's sympathy versus empathy. And so, yes, I think that showcasing images that portray the sort of personal moments behind tragedy are just as important, if not more important, to connecting us to those people.
Tara, I think all of your photographs reflects a positive thing, and this kind of empathy is what we could see in these photographs. Thank you for being with us. Now, HOD Manju ma'am will talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tara Pixley, for the inspiring session. It's truly essential to have diversity in front of the camera and behind the camera. Yes, photojournalists must tell visual stories of diversity, of inclusiveness. More photojournalists must come forward, breaking the shackles of the society and create visual stories that challenged the perceived norms, highlight solutions, and positiveness. We look forward to having you as a speaker for advanced training sessions in the future. Best wishes for your wide spectrum of endeavors. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Archana Soring. Archana is the member of United Nations Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, established by the Secretary General of United Nations as part of United Nations Youth Strategy. She is the only member from India. Others are from Sudan, Fiji, Moldova, United States, France, and Brazil. Archana is experienced in advocacy and research, and she is working to document, preserve, and promote traditional knowledge and cultural practices of indigenous communities. The climate activist is from Rourkela in Odisha. She studied MA in Regulatory Governance from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, in Mumbai. She is former national convener of Tribal Commission at Adivasi Yuva Chedana Manch, All India Catholic University Federation, ICAF. Archana Soring is the former Students' Union President of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Currently, she is a research officer at TIS Forest Rights and Governance Project in Odisha. Title of her session is Photojournalism, a way to document, preserve, and promote traditional conservation, knowledge, and practices of indigenous communities. Welcome, Archana.
Thank you, Manju ma'am, for this beautiful introduction, and Johar everyone. I'm very happy to be here amongst you all, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity. So as my session says, it's photojournalism, a way to document, preserve, and promote traditional knowledge and practices of the indigenous community. So starting about, I feel when we talk about photojournalism is a new medium of mass communication and quite popular if we see it in the 21st century. It is very interesting to understand and explore the dimension which photojournalism has. And if you understand photojournalism, I think it is to understand photography and photos in a amazing method wherein the physical realm is brought into the digital and virtual domain. So thus, if we see the photojournalism has different capabilities and has capabilities to tell stories through photos. So talking about, to start with, if I talk about mass communication as a large, so in the indigenous communities, the concept of mass communication has always been there throughout the ages and years. When I see mass communication from indigenous perspective, I feel the indigenous community is very communitarian and does not believe in accumulation of information or experience, rather believes in sharing at large the history, culture, and tradition. the few ways of mass communication in the tribal communities which has been there through years is through the way of oral history, through songs, through dance, and through folklores. And that is how their traditional knowledge and practices of the sustainable way of living and forest conservation also has been documented in the songs, uh, dance, and folklores. And when I talk specifically in terms of what is the need of documenting these practices, histories, and struggles of the indigenous communities, I feel the need of documentation is to enable transition of these knowledge and practices from the earlier generation to the present generation and also to the upcoming generation. So before I move on critically towards photojournalism, I talk about give an example of how powerful mass communication in the indigenous communities has been. So now I'll be going to sing a song. This song is in my tribal language, that is Khadiya. I belong to Khadiya tribe. So this song is a documentation of the massacre of the tribal communities in my state in Odisha. This is of 1939, when there was British era, and when the Adivasis and the forest dwelling communities asserted their rights over the land and forest. They had organized a peaceful protest where there were more than 1,000 people, and they had called for a dialogue with the king, with the queen and king at that point of time. But the king and the queen came, but they cheated on the tribal communities, and they brought a large number of soldiers and massacred them. So the song goes this way. Amko simko podate adibasi doklo no doko ki amko simko podate adibasi doklo no doko ki राजा रानी दिल की माँ जोड़ा पलटन ओलो माँ रिया पारे जाते तारो माँ. The reason behind singing this song and bringing this narrative in this discussion is that I have never read about this historical injustice or struggle of my ancestors. Never in my textbooks have I come across about it. How did I know about this struggle and battle and massacre and this historical injustice? I got to know from my grandparents, from my uncle and aunts, because these were the songs which they sing in all the ceremonies of the indigenous communities. And because now I know our language of the tribal communities, I'm able to understand this. And now that I have learned this and I'm documenting it in a visual way, or in terms of audio, in terms of video, we are creating an evidence for the upcoming generation. Because if we don't document it, the upcoming generation will not be aware of the struggles of our indigenous communities and how historical injustice have been done. So now when we talk about photojournalism in specific, photojournalism is the new tool which is currently most prevalent in the 21st century. Now, how can we use photojournalism for documenting the traditional knowledge and practices and historical struggles and challenges faced by the indigenous communities? One example, I feel, I think everyone reads about. There has been land grabbing, displacement, and establishment of extractive developmental projects in the indigenous communities area. And there has been also, if we see internationally and through UN, recognize that the indigenous communities have been protecting the forest, and if we see 80% of the biodiversity are protected by the indigenous communities. So two photos, one photos where the community members are protecting it, where they are going for patrolling the forest, and another photo where there is establishment of extractive developmental projects and the emission caused by it and the felling caused by it, says a volumes of words or says a very deeper meaning. Only these two images, one images prior to the extractive development and one images post extractive development. So I feel now at the time when everyone is very busy, people are very busy even to see 1 minute video or see 30 seconds video, that time the role of photojournalism I feel is very important, because through photos we can give an information or disseminate knowledge in just a glimpse, as I said about these two photos. Moving on to the traditional conservational knowledge and practices, so if we take uh, plastic pollution, the indigenous communities have alternatives to plastic pollutions. They are making leaf plates through sal leaf, siali leaves, through banana leaves, which again, those leaf plates are alternative to plastic. Now, how can we document these making of leaf plates, or how can we show uh, that these leaf plates are alternative to plastic? I feel there again, two photos, one photos in which we showing that the indigenous communities are making leaf plates and are also having food through that leaf plates, and the other photo can be, how there has been disposal of plastic plates all across, creating waste problems. These two photos itself shows that how there has been contradiction in the cities and how the community members in the village levels are adopting this sustainable way of leaf plates. Moving on, if I talk about another sustainable way which the indigenous communities has been practicing and which I have seen from my very childhood, is that if we see vegetables like, pumpkin and bottle gourd, who has a huge radius, which have circular radius, so in my community members, so that the pulp of pumpkin and bottle gourd is used for making vegetables, but the outer crust of pumpkin and bottle gourd is used as is dried and is used as water bottles in our community members. And when they go for agriculture practices, this is the dried pumpkin and the dried bottle gourd skins wherein they are filling the water bottle, which is again very much sustainable and eco-friendly, contradictory to the plastic water bottles which we are carrying. So I think these photos says a volumes like how indigenous communities have been adopting these practices. Now, why this is important? I feel I in my generation I saw that how my community members and how my family members, are using the pumpkin and bottle gourds as water bottles. But I am very much unsure, if we don't document, whether will the upcoming generation know about it. And thus these photos are a major source of evidence. And when I talk about photojournalism as a way of, documenting it, I also feel it is very important for us to document not only what is the output or the ultimate product. Like, for example, we can make a series of photo. First photo is of the pumpkin, second photo how the pulp is used for making vegetables, third photo how the pumpkin's skin is dried up, and fourth photo is how water is filled in that pumpkin and it is used. So these series of photo says a story, says a solution which is alternative to plastic. Moving ahead, my grandmother and indigenous community members also make carpets out of the date leaves. Now the thing is, do we youth, even the indigenous youth, given the glimpse of imposition of globalization and modernization, because there has been a cultural loss because of imposition and modernization. I feel it is very important that we indigenous youth also adopt these practices and also know more about it, and therein I feel photojournalism comes more in play. Now it is my grandmother who knows how to stitch that carpet. I am really unsure, if we don't document that, how will the other community or the upcoming generation know about it? Having said that, I also do understand the problem of migration, wherein because of certain developmental projects and other reasons also, the youth are migrated from their grandparents and from the community members also. I feel this photojournalism is also a tool for documenting these traditional knowledge and practices, not only for the global world but also for the indigenous youth specifically. Now moving on to the practices which they have, the traditional rotational agriculture practices, the varieties of crops which they are growing. I think now there's a modern prevalent term called organic farming, but when I reflect, organic farming has been prevalent in the indigenous community since ages. It's just, I feel, there in the concept of experts coming. I think there is very much need today to rethink who are these experts, to decode who are we thinking as experts today, because I feel it is only when a source of information or knowledge is coming from experts, people have the tendency to document it, people have the tendency to photograph it, people have a tendency to capture it. And that is why I think the indigenous community members, the elders, the indigenous leaders are the ones who are expert. Yes, through the educational qualification they may be illiterate, but the immense wisdom they have and the knowledge which they have in terms of ecological restoration, forest conservation is immense. And that is how we need to see them, from that lens, that they are the experts, and that is why they need to be incorporated in this entire process of documentation and preservation, and therein the role of photojournalism comes in. Now, going further deeper, I strongly feel when we talk about photojournalism or any kind of journalism for that matter, I feel it is very important that free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous communities is taken. Because most of the time, because of the traditional knowledge and practices and how it has a positive impact towards climate action, there has been a tendency to capture those through photography as well. But have we taken their consent is a question which comes in my mind very often. Because when I talk about consent, I think it is very important for a photojournalist also to understand their way of living, to understand their worldview. And I do understand it takes an effort for research, it takes an effort to go to the community, to interact with the community, and make it a very inclusive and holistic process. And that is why I feel it is very important that free, prior, informed consent is taken. And next thing, I also feel that when we emphasize about photojournalism of documenting these traditional culture practices, I think the quotient of respect needs to be there, because we need to understand that we all come from various ethnicity and culturally diversity. What is sustainable for me may not be sustainable for you. What ethically is good for me may not be ethically good for you. But when you are capturing or documenting of the tribal communities or of the indigenous communities, a journalist or a photojournalist needs to make effort that they are understanding their perspective, their values, their feelings attached to their traditional knowledge and practices or their cultures. Because ultimately, I think it is very important that the photo which will be out, which will be clicked, it is not the mere photo or material which the photographer taken, but it should also be seen as the output of the indigenous communities or of the person whom the photo is taken, so that I feel equally the photo of the person of the area which has been taken is equally happy and supportive along with the photojournalist who has taken, wherein I feel there is very important to sit together and do a dialogue where enables understanding, a dialogue where removes all the prejudice, a dialogue which enables the similar way of understanding. Because if those prior efforts are not there before taking that photography, the I don't I feel that will not be able to reach out to the end product. That end product is moving towards a collective action, and therefore I feel photojournalism is a source of collective action and is a medium of collective action, and hence we need to incorporate the indigenous communities, the people those who are photographed, the peoples whose areas are photographed, and the person who is taking the photograph. And having said that, I strongly feel, coming from an indigenous background, that mass media and photojournalism is very well taken off by the indigenous youth as well. But I feel there is an immense need of support and strength, wherein the indigenous youth themselves can speak about their thoughts, their culture, their history, their practices, because we need to empower them and make an enabling space wherein they can speak for themselves through their own photography. My photograph, my story. And that is what I also would like to say to all the youth, those who have joined here. It's photojournalism is a very important tool, and given the digital movement which we are seeing globally, it is a very important tool to capture and to get to know information about a lot of issues and challenges, or possibles a best solution pertaining to climate action across the globe. It also helps us to understand what is happening in other parts of the globe. But at the same time, I also feel there is a need to institutionalize these efforts by the photojournalists, those who are taking these efforts, because I feel it is very important to ensure safe spaces, enabling spaces for the photojournalists, those who are working, because they are the ones who are bringing us the grassroots reality or the ground truthing report. And hence, I feel it is very important to encourage photojournalists and to enable them to in a more safer environment. So this is what I would like to say. And the last line which I would like to say is, every action can be made into a collective action. So thus, I feel photojournalism is a mode of collective action for climate action.
Thank you. Thank you, Archana, for your lovely talk. And do you have time for one or two questions of
Yes.
our audience? Okay. So our moderator, Tara Sibi, will ask you the questions of our audiences.
Hello, Krishna. We are very happy to hear you how brilliantly you blend the indigenous community and the thoughts of global climate concepts and photography. And now we move on to our first question. Would you tell us the importance of indigenous women or people to control the climate change? Please tell us more about it.
Yeah, so if we talk about the IPBES report, so it says that the indigenous community members are contributing towards forest protection and biodiversity restoration. And but they are the ones who are most affected by the climate crisis. So then I feel that is why, their rights over the land and forest needs to be recognized, and they need to be secured, because only when the indigenous community members will be secured, they will be able to continue their traditional knowledge and practices and their way of forest protection. What are the ways of forest protection? Because given the limited time, I'll just share one example where women and the communities protecting the forest. So here in Odisha, there is a forest conservation practice called Thenga Pali. So Thenga means stick and Pali means turns. So in through this forest conservation methods, this is a women-led forest protection method. So wherein women, every day 4 women are going to for forest patrolling, and when they are going forest patrolling, it is also a means to see that the how the health of the forest is, and also to prevent the timber mafias coming in the forest and cutting the forest. And having said that, these women get up early in the morning at 3 a.m. along with all their household chores. They are going and protecting and patrolling forest. Now the reason is we need to reflect why these women or the indigenous communities are protecting the forest. They are protecting the forest because for them this is the life and identity, and they know that if they are not living a sustainable way of living with the forest, then they themselves will not be sustained. And when every day they are coming back after forest patrolling, and then they are giving the stick to another 4 women, and in that way rotationally the entire village women are protecting the forest there. And as a result of this forest protection, initially when in 1970s there were timber felling and immense number of forest destruction, now the forest cover has increased here in Odisha.
We have a question from our fellow teacher, that is Ninu. That is, what is your opinion on Amazon rainforest destruction?
I could not hear it.
What is your opinion on Amazon rainforest destruction? Do photojournalists have something to do with that?
Yeah, I think photojournalism has an important role to play in that, in Amazon forest destruction, because I think what photojournalism can do is to bring narrative, is to bring perspective of the people. And I feel the indigenous communities, those who are protecting the forest there through the traditional ways and practices, and also how they are impacted, those stories can be captured through photos, their efforts of forest conservation, and also at the same time what are the destructive developmental, extractive developmental projects have been done there. For wherein I feel it is important, to when we talk about photojournalism, to highlight the good practices of the community members, to also highlight how they are suffering because of the climate crisis and because of the external factors like extractive developmental projects.
Okay, thank you, Archana. Thank you for being with us. I think you have given another dimension to our webinar by blending the indigenous folk culture by singing the song and all. Now, HOD Manju ma'am will talk to you.
And thank you, Archana. Thanks for your perspective on the importance of documenting indigenous culture, and also for your beautiful song. And photojournalism have a great role for this. We wish you great success with your new role for United Nations Security General. Thank you once again.
Thank you, ma'am.
So we are going to conclude our session, but before that, we can't conclude this without remembering our poet, Professor Oyenvi Kurup, who was a legendary poet in Malayalam language, a great vocal for protecting the environment. His celebrated poem, Bhumikkoru Charamagidam, a requiem for Mother Earth, following the Silent Valley agitation to protect the rainforests of Kerala, reflected his environmental concerns. Professor Oyenvi was obsessively worried about the environment, its trees and dying rivers. We are sharing a small clip from the visual representation of his poem, Bhumikkoru Charamagidam, a requiem of Mother Earth, produced by our principal, Dr. Jolie Jacob. This film won several awards. So now we are concluding this webinar. Photojournalism becomes even more powerful when we have solutions approach. Journalists must explore and report more inclusive stories. The world needs more solutions-based visual stories on gender, climate change, indigenous culture, marginalized people, refugees, and many more. It is essential to have a new approach to portray people and communities as active agents of change rather than as passive victims. Photojournalists have an important role in winning back the public trust with good journalism, with good visuals that inspire people to think about solutions. Media researchers can explore the effectiveness of solutions-based approach in photojournalism and empirically proving efficacy. We media educators have a greater responsibility to integrate solutions-based photojournalism and visual storytelling in the curriculum and providing a greater skill set for future journalists to excel. Thank you all for joining in. On behalf of the speakers and the organizing team, we express our sincere gratitude to all participants for your active participation. And one more thing, if you Google Daniel, you can see his movie and how he had went through his being a hostage. For the kind information of the participants, e-certificates of participation will be provided to all of you who submit the feedback form. The link is now shared in the comment box. Good night and stay safe. Signing off from Team Nagar, Maranellur, Trivandrum.